There we go. Okay. They're not always with awns, however. So here are some that are awnless. And you can see on these close-ups, they might have a little mucro or a little awn tip. Uh, Almost always the costa is prominent and extends out, usually excurrent at least a little bit. There's a few that are maybe that end before the end of the leaf. These ones that don't have prominent awns tend to be more scattered. So this photo up here in the upper right, you can see that you have almost all these little individual plants. You don't get that cushiony effect or mat-like effect. Here it's filling in a little bit. Uh, I've got the word dull there. When you're in the field and you pick these things up and look at them, they generally don't appear any kind of glossy aspect. We'll find out why later. It's because of the papillae. So they're masking the reflective ability. When you wet them, then you get this glossy, wetted look like you have down here. Let me just say, anytime you want to add something or ask or interrupt, please just go right ahead. Or correct, that would be helpful as well. Down here, and I suspect in a lot of where you are, you're going to find them dry. I really can't remember the last time I saw Syntrichia wet and open, but we see them like this. So they're folded up, the leaves are folded in some way, and the words you'll see are all these different kinds of words. They might be straight, like we see here. They might be twisted, like you get a little bit here, twisting. They might use the word folded. We see that kind of here where they're kind of bent. Well, these are folded as well, folded lengthwise. Or you'll see the words coiled or curled or contorted. The ones that form mats and cushions, you generally have something like this. The ones that form individual shoots, you'll see this kind of arrangement. The first time you see something like this, where they're sort of bent over and coiled, you don't really think Syntrichia. This is an awnless species. And so there's a lot of variation there, of course, but those are some of the words that come to mind. I got this slide off of the University of California website. It's an NSF collaborative project. So you can see some of the leaf variation. There's some things in common. And then here are some words that might pop up. I think Mo is going to talk about word definitions, and I don't know that you can match those words specifically up with ones here, but in general, in Syntrichia, they're broadened at the distal end, like we see here. And we see a little bit here and here. That's very common. Also very common is to have a more oblong with kind of parallel sides, like we see here. As that becomes elongate, they might call it tongue-shaped. This would be kind of an extreme spatulate shape. Sometimes you get a narrowing in the distal half. That's not too uncommon, but in general, the distal half is the wider or the widest part of the leaf. So these are all fairly typical. Their shapes, they're fairly broad. The costa is prominent. Once you get them wetted on the slide, often they open right up, although sometimes you'll catch them folded. So those are some pretty typical shapes, and often nearly as wide at the base as at the tip, I guess. Another thing they'll talk about are these windows at the base of the leaves. These are cells that are clear or hyaline. Let me see what the next. Here's some that show that. So these cells at the base are often referred to as windows, hyaline, clear cells, markedly different than the upper portion. A lot of the books talk about a U-shaped window. So there's a U and there's a U. Here on the side, you can sort of see a U right there. But I find you just as often you find them just sort of vague like this or like that or like some of these others. So those
Kelly,
windows, yes,
is Syntrichia the only genus that has these windows?
no. And I'll mention that a little bit later, but there are several genera, particularly one in particular that looks very much like this. But in the Podiaceae, you find maybe not quite as marked off, but sometimes a more gradual, but they'll have the clear windows at the base. So that
Kelly,
helps. Yes?
we have a question about what does pandurate mean? Pandurate.
Oh, yeah, I forgot about that. I just threw that in because you see that. That means violin shaped or constricted in the middle. Thank you for bringing that up. I don't know that I've ever used that word, but it pops up in some of the keys. So kind of constricted there, like a violin is constricted in the middle.
Kelly, Erin has
Yes?
a question. She wants to know if those clear cells are what are called alar cells. It's the same
Well, the
thing.
alar region would be right here. And so I guess you could maybe talk about alar cells, but they're not distinguished really from the associated cells. And so there isn't really a clear alar region, but that's where you would look. But they're all kind of the same. You get a little bit of a difference right here, but you don't see this word alar cells used that much in Syntrichia in my off the top of my head remembrance. But that's where you would look to find them.
Thanks.
Okay. Other things you'll notice here are the margins are noticeably flat or plain. And also very, here's one that's kind of looks like it's flattish. We'll see later what that might be, but here's a definite rolled margin, which would be revolute rolled downward. You can see that revolute margin right there. That's very common in many species, but we have many species that are unrolled like that. That rolling could be a general mild rolling, and so they might use recurved. Revolute would be a little tighter. Any questions on this slide? I can show that on the next one. Here you see some of the cross sections that illustrate that. So the rolling, this someone might say this is just merely recurved. Here is a revolute margin. This is a revolute margin. We can see one stratos leaf blades, that is one cell thick. This appears to be one stratos. It's kind of cut on the angle. Here are two stratos leaf blades, and definitely two stratos here. Now, we won't talk too much about the anatomy, but there's some interesting things, particularly these guide cells. Usually, I don't know, 2 to 3, maybe 4 guide cells. This is the costa, so we've cut right down through the leaf, and these clear guide cells are usually very prominent. Here they are right here. Here they are right there. This, you don't see them so clearly because of the angle of the cut. And then another distinguishing feature is this, what's referred to as an abaxial steroid band. So this is the abaxial surface, the lower or the outer surface. And the steroids are these, oh, excuse me, let me turn that off. Sorry. Are these thick-walled cells surrounding the functioning cells on the interior. So the steroid band is here, steroid band is here. There is no ad or upper steroid band in Syntrichia. So you may not get to that level right away, but sooner or later you're going to have to make a cross section, and that helps to see a lot of these things. Any questions? Okay. Here we look at some of those other cross sections. A one stratos cross section. The steroid bands are always very distinctive. Here is this cross-section through the proximal or lower portion of the leaf. This is where the windows would be. So the cells are all clear. This would be up a little bit farther and they're starting to fill in. And then here is a giant leaf with big cells. And the thing we notice there are these fantastic papillae. And here are some papillae right on the costa. Very, very noticeable. This is a plain or slightly recurved leaf. This would be plain. This would be revolute. If you were to look downward on a, not a cross section, but a face view and look downward in that direction, this might look like a roll leaf because you would see all of this looking down. So sometimes making a cut saves a lot of grief. Here are the features of the papillae. The cells themselves in face view are generally quadrate, squarish. You sort of make that up. They have lots of papillae on the cells, and so you can see all of these papillae. They're often described as C-shaped papillae, and so you can look here on a lot of them. Very clear, kind of curved. So here you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or maybe 6 papillae on a single cell. We find out that those papillae are actually sitting on little stems or little stalks that raises them up. And so here are the papillae out here, and they're sort of branched, and that's what gives these different shapes here. But on this exceptional case, we've got this giant stalk and then the branched papillae up here. This would be a revolute margin. Why say with many papillae when you can say pluripapillose? Okay, the one that when I think I have a Syntrichia, I always think, or could it be a tortula? So I think you'll always want to think of these two together when you're trying to identify. All of Syntrichia used to be included in tortula. They're very similar. So you can see the way they grow. Here's a tortula in a clump. The leaf shape, the way it spreads is similar. Here are the more scattered shoots or stems. It's very similar. Here are leaf shapes. So tortula may have obviously spatulate leaves. I think they tend, however, to have leaves that tend to narrow from about the midpoint. They tend to narrow toward the apex. So that's just a trend kind of in my head there. But that seems to be a little more common in tortula than we find in Syntrichia. Tortula can be awned or nearly awnless. They have the clear areas. These are both tortula. They have the clear windows at the base. This even has a U-shaped band to it. So that is similar. Here are the C-shaped papillae in tortula. I don't think it holds always, or maybe not even the majority of cases, but I tend to think of tortula as having smaller leaves than Syntrichia. I'm sure the leaf length overlaps in a lot of them, but in the tortula that I'm familiar with, they tend to be smaller leaves, and the Syntrichia tend to be larger leaves. This is based on my experience in New Mexico. The way to tell is to give it a drop of 2% KOH. Tortula is yellow when it's treated with KOH. Syntrichia is reddish, orangish when it's treated in KOH, sometimes brick red like we see here. Now, everything I've kind of said has to be taken with a generally. These are trends. When you get to identifying, I'll often start down in Syntrichia and then say, I better check out some tortula or vice versa. Others know them perhaps better than I, and so they're much more confident in what they do. But this, I hope, helps you to have an idea of what Syntrichia looks like and some of the things that you're going to want to look at. Any other questions? That's the end of my presentation.
Yeah, I have a question. If you can remember in your key, what splits Tortula from Syntrichia?
In New Mexico, leaf size does that pretty well.
Okay.
However, I got thinking about that today, wondering, that might be a place where I should put put Tortula on both sides of the key. But as it sits now, leaf size uses that for our New Mexico species. But I say that with a little bit of trepidation. I may need to update and correct that key a little bit. Nothing like, the first edition of a book.
Hey, Mo,
Yeah.
if you're trying to key out something that's a Syntrichia and it won't key out, that's usually my signal that I should be looking in Tortula.
Okay.
There's a